In the previous chapters, Hayek has been building an argument slowly. That central planning is not just an economic error, it is a political transformation. Because once the state attempts to direct the economy, it must also direct the choices of individuals. Chapter 7 is where Hayek becomes most direct. This is the chapter where he explains why economic control cannot remain limited. It cannot remain democratic, and it cannot remain morally neutral. Because the deeper the plan becomes, the more coercion becomes unavoidable. The chapter is titled Economic Control and Totalitarianism, and Hayek's message is simple but unsettling. If you control the economy, you control life itself. Why economic control is political control. Hayek begins with an observation that planners often resist. They imagine the economy as something separate, as if economic life is merely material, something beneath politics, something technical. But Hayek insists economic control is never merely economic, because economic choices are not peripheral. They determine the shape of human life. What job one has, what goods are available, what opportunities exist, where people may live, what one may aspire toward. To direct economic activity is to direct the ends people can pursue. And so, planning is not like fixing a machine, it is like arranging society itself. Once the state assumes responsibility for economic outcomes, it must choose between competing needs, between competing desires, between competing people, and that choice is inherently political. The impossibility of a single plan in a free society. Hayek's next point is foundational. A free society contains pluralism. Different people want different things. They value different ends. They pursue different visions of the good life. In a market system, those differences coexist. There is no single hierarchy of priorities. People coordinate voluntarily, through prices and exchange, without requiring essential moral authority. But planning requires something else. Planning requires unity. A plan cannot serve every end equally. It must rank goals. It must decide what is more important, housing or defense, consumption or investment, equality or growth, one region over another, one industry over another. And once such rankings are enforced, society is no longer a field of free choice, but an imposed ordering. This is why Hayek says, the more detailed the plan, the more disagreement must be suppressed, because freedom means conflict of ends. Planning means uniformity of ends, and those two principles cannot coexist indefinitely. Coercion is not an accident, but a requirement. Hayek now addresses a common illusion. Many planners believe coercion arises only from bad people, that the problem is simply corruption, or authoritarian personalities, or improper safeguards. But Hayek argues the opposite. Coercion is not an accident, it is a structural necessity, because once the state directs economic life, it must compel compliance. If a person refuses the plan, they are no longer merely choosing differently, they become an obstacle. If the plan requires labor in one sector, workers must be moved. If resources must be allocated, consumption must be limited. If production targets must be met, dissent cannot be tolerated. And so, what begins as economic coordination becomes enforcement. The plan is not optional. It becomes law. Hayek's warning is that planning creates conditions in which coercion expands naturally. not necessarily because planners are evil, but because the system cannot function otherwise. Totalitarianism as the logic of control. Hayek then makes the central argument of the chapter that totalitarianism is not an historical accident, but a potential outcome of comprehensive economic planning. Why? Because to administer an entire economy is to administer an entire society. Once the government controls employment, wages, prices, production, and distribution, it holds power over every individual's livelihood. And if your livelihood depends on the state, your freedom becomes conditional. Economic dependence becomes political dependence, and political dependence becomes submission. Hayek's point is that under such conditions, the boundary between economic administration and political domination disappears. The tools of planning become the tools of control. Why the worst get on top? This chapter also connects directly to Hayek's later argument that the kind of people attracted to absolute power are rarely the best. But here, Hayek begins the groundwork, because the more coercive the system becomes, the more it demands ruthlessness. A planner must override resistance. A manager must impose priorities. A state must enforce compliance. And so, the system selects for those willing to do so, not necessarily the wisest, not necessarily the most humane, but the most decisive, the most unrestrained. Hayek is describing a moral gravity, the institutional tendency of planning to elevate those who can enforce it. Liberty becomes a word with a different meaning. Hayek also notes something psychological. In such systems, even language changes. Planners still speak of freedom, but freedom comes to mean something else. Not freedom from coercion, but freedom from necessity, freedom from want, freedom as security. And Hayek does not deny the appeal. People desire stability. They desire protection from risk. But he warns, if freedom is redefined as provision, then coercion can be justified as benevolence. The plan becomes for your own good, and liberty becomes conditional upon obedience. The road is gradual. Hayek is careful here. He does not claim that every welfare policy is dictatorship. He does not claim that every state action is tyranny. His argument is subtler. The road is gradual. The danger lies in direction, not instant transformation. Once society accepts the principle that the economy must be centrally directed, each step requires another. More regulation, more enforcement, more authority. The road is not a coup, it is a slope. The moral core of the chapter. At its deepest level, Chapter 7 is not simply economic, it is moral. Hayek is asking, what kind of society do we become when decisions are no longer made by individuals, but by administrators? When life becomes an allocation problem, when politics becomes management, when freedom becomes permission. In such a world, the human person is no longer a chooser, but a unit within a plan. And Hayek's warning is that even with good intentions, this transformation has consequences, because control requires compulsion, and compulsion is the seed of serfdom. So Chapter 7 brings us to the hard truth. Economic planning is not merely economic. It is a transfer of power from individuals to the state. And once the state holds that power, it cannot remain neutral. It must rank ends, it must enforce priorities, and it must compel compliance. That is why Hayek believes that the dream of a fully planned society cannot be separated from the reality of coercion. The danger is not the villain, the danger is the administrator. Not hatred, but management. Not conquest, but inevitability. And the question Hayek leaves us with is this: how much control can society surrender before freedom itself becomes impossible? Chapter 7 is one of the clearest warnings in the book, and in the next chapter, Hayek will push even further into the political psychology of how planned systems select the kind of rulers they require. Thank you for watching. If you found this chapter analysis valuable, please consider liking, subscribing, and continuing with me through Hayek's road to serfdom.